Thank you for joining me for a very special program introducing a new Lights Out Colorado program to be jointly sponsored by the Audubon Society and the International Dark Sky Association. I'm Megan Wilbar, Museum Coordinator for the InfoZone Museum at the Rawlings Library. Tonight's discussion will be led by Zach Hutchinson of Audubon Rockies, Dr. Kyle Horton of Colorado State University, and Richard O'Brien of the International Dark Sky Association. The discussion will include an overview of the Lights Out Colorado program, the problems of lighting and migratory birds, and how Audubon members and IDA members might promote this program. Joining me is Peg Rooney, President of Arkansas Valley Audubon Society, and also our founder for this series of programs, Zach Hutchinson, a community naturalist and the Community Science Coordinator for Audubon Rockies. He is a bird bander engaging students and adults in bird banding projects. Dr. Kyle Horton, an assistant professor at Colorado State University. His research includes many published papers applying radar data to questions of nocturnal bird migration. Richard O'Brien, a volunteer board member and communications coordinator of the Colorado chapter of the International Dark Sky Association. He's active in community outreach about light pollution problems. Thank you for joining me this evening. Our presenters will be answering questions at the end, so please type your questions in the comments box. I'll now turn the screen over to Peg, and then we'll jump right into our program.
Great, thanks, Megan. I want to welcome you all here tonight and encourage you to get involved in protecting birds, other wildlife, and their habitats. You know, we've lost 3 billion birds since the 1970s, and that's no small thing because birds are indicators of the health of the planet. So I want to encourage you to join Audubon in the fight to protect the birds that we love, to protect our planet, and ultimately to protect ourselves. So membership information is on our website, Southern Colorado Birds, abbreviated SOCO, S-O-C-O, so socobirds.org. Hope you'll join us in the fight. And now I'll turn things over to our panelists.
Okay, let's see if I can get this going. So Megan or Peg, can you confirm that you can see my screen? Uh-oh. Looks like I lost Megan and Peg. I can't hear Megan.
And I'm also muted. So once you get your screen up, then you're up. But okay.
Good, thank you.
I'll take myself away, so I'm not here.
Sure, and I wanted some confirmation of there. I'll share again. Okay, I'm Richard O'Brien, and we're here to talk about Lights Out Colorado, which is a program we're developing to help migratory birds. Let's see. And we're jointly sponsored by the Audubon Society and the International Dark Sky Association. I'm with the International Dark Sky Association. And here we'll start with a cartoon here. It's hard to imagine how birds think, but the whole idea of them flying away from the light is kind of humorous to me. But that's what they really need to do, is fly away from the light. Okay, so the Lights Out Colorado proposal will be to help birds. The goal is to help birds during nocturnal migrations in eastern Colorado. And we're focusing on the Front Range urban corridor because that's where the most light pollution is. We're asking all Coloradoans, regardless of where they live, to shut off all outdoor lights by midnight during migration seasons and to shield all outdoor lights. Okay, tonight's goal is really to gather comments. So each of the three panelists will have a short presentation to make, but then we're going to have a discussion. And this is the project is a work in progress, so any details we talk about tonight may change before we actually launch the program. Tonight's discussion, as I've started out with a brief introduction, and then we have Zach Hutchinson from Audubon Rockies will have a short presentation. Dr. Kyle Horton from Colorado State University will have a short presentation, and then I'll have a short presentation about shielding and the light curfew, followed by a discussion from all of us. So I think we're ready to move on. Let me unshare my screen, and then it'll be time for Zach to take over, I think.
Okay, here we go. So thank you, Richard, first for putting this together, and thank you, Dr. Horton, for joining us on this, and thanks to Arkansas Valley Audubon Society and the Rawlings Library. This is a very important topic and topical while we're on the trailing end of our fall migration season. So I'm just going to hit very big points. You have to understand there's a lot more nuance and there's a lot more information out there. And luckily tonight we have like one of the foremost authorities on this topic in Dr. Horton. So I'm just going to hit very big ideas about artificial light and its effects on birds. And so there's a lot more to it. So understand this is a very big picture idea of this issue. So let me move us forward. So real quick, Audubon Rockies, we are the National Audubon Society. Specifically, Audubon Rockies is the regional office of the National Audubon Society that serves the region of Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah. And so as part of National Audubon Society, we protect birds in the places they need today and tomorrow. And that's why this is important to Audubon. We're here to protect birds. Now, specifically, Audubon Rockies is part of the Central Flyway. And you can see our office locations were scattered throughout the region. And Utah, we just recently, in the past few years, brought Utah into our working region. And our head office is in Fort Collins, although I am located in central Wyoming. Now, big picture, okay, the large majority of birds in North America are migratory. Okay, so you're talking 70% of our regularly occurring species are migratory. And then from that, 80% of those birds are nocturnal migrants, meaning they migrate at nighttime. And this is all important because it's leading up to what our issues are, okay? Now, you may have heard about the 3 billion birds study that came out a few years ago. It may have been last year. Everything's moving so fast anymore. But essentially, one of the big takeaways from that study is that since 1970, we have lost 3 billion birds. And now that's not just 3 billion individuals. That means we are seeing population declines, okay? Major population declines. And some birds are hit harder than others. And so this little graphic shows you specifically, it's talking about Baltimore orioles, which is an eastern species. In Colorado and Wyoming, we don't see them as frequently, but it just gets at the point. Birds are being impacted specifically by humans. And some of the major players in this, habitat loss, there's pesticides, there's cats, there's collisions, and light pollution plays a major role in that. There we go. Okay. So artificial light at night, just very broadly on the topic, 99% of the public in North America and Europe, they don't get to experience a natural night, meaning without artificial light polluting their experience or their sky. In between 2006 and 2012, approximately 80 countries saw an increase in their artificial light radiance at 110% or greater. Think about that. That means the amount of artificial light radiance that's being produced in their area is increasing, and that's in 80 countries. So that's not just North America, right? That's around the globe. And then if you think about where a lot of that increased radiance is, 120 terawatt hours of energy is used just for outdoor lighting, with the majority of that being on roads and parking lots, which at night, especially, we all know most parking lots aren't being used at nighttime, especially when you're talking about, you know, businesses that run typical 8 to 5 schedules. And so as it relates to birds, especially when we're thinking of light, unshielded light able then to reach up higher into the sky where these nocturnal migrants are migrating. You know, they're not migrating at tree level, right? They are migrating much higher. And there's a video here that really speaks to me and its impact when I first saw it. Really just, it grabbed a hold of me, and I'll show that here in just a moment. But it's these lights that disorient birds. They'll circle, they'll increase their calling, so they're flying around in their flocks, and they're using their migration calls, you know, communicating within the flock, and that increases. They're confused, and it's to see it is horrifying, and then to understand how it affects them is even worse. So if you think about artificial light and birds, this first number, the 350 million to 1 billion birds that collide with buildings, not all of that is necessarily nocturnal migration related, but it is in that number. So these lights are causing birds to be disoriented, confused, and they can collide with buildings, with windows. Okay, there's a lot of studies on the September 11th tribute lights, and some of the results of that showed the increased density. So you're seeing in those lights, compared to the baseline areas in around the tribute lights, you're seeing an increase of 20 to 150 in density. So there's more birds coming to those lights. They're being drawn to those lights. They're decreasing their flight speeds. They're circling, and then they're increasing vocalizations. And birds, oftentimes an increase in vocalization is a signal of stress. Now, not always, but frequently it can be. And then if they're circling and not actually making their movement where they need to be, getting away from the lights, they're going to be using up fat stores, and then also drawing on muscle tissue. As their fat stores go down, then their body starts to use, you know, calories from anywhere it can get it, and that goes into their muscle tissue. And there's a correlation between poor body condition and lower survivorship and productivity, meaning surviving from 1 year to the next, and then adding back into their own population. And there's probably either studies going on right now, or there will be future studies on artificial light as an artificial gene barrier. And so there's so many other issues within this, but these are big picture things that you can understand, that light creates problems for birds, artificial light. And so this is the video, and I'm just gonna show it. It's very short, but it's impactful. So and you can see Dr. Horton is listed on this because it's from a publication that Dr. Horton was involved in. Those are not insects; those are birds. And the cliche, like a moth to a flame, could not speak louder than this video, where these are birds, and you can see they're just flying around in these lights. And you know, to try to describe them as disoriented is probably the best term we can use. But that video, the first time I saw it, was just shocking to me, and I hope that it also resonates with you, because that is powerful to just see. There are hundreds of birds within that image, and that's just 30 seconds of an evening with those lights, with artificial lights. And specifically in this case, these are unshielded lights projected straight into the air. Let's see, project it. So if you have further questions, just ways to get a hold of me after this. If we don't get to your question within the presentation, you're also welcome to reach out to me. And with that, I will turn it over. I guess I'll turn it back over to Richard, who will introduce Dr. Horton.
Oh, okay. Dr. Horton, I think you're up. Can we hear some more about research, please? I think you're on mute. Oh, there we go.
Can you see my screen and
I
hear me
see
okay?
the screen and I can hear you now.
Perfect. Okay, yeah, so I'll get started. Again, thanks for the invitation here. I'm quite excited to talk about this topic. So what I'll be going through today is how we use radar, primarily radar data, to look at migratory birds moving across the landscape of the United States and North America at large. And I'll certainly focus on the light pollution side and the research we've been working on for 5+ years now. So I just want to give a little bit of background before we launch into any research results per se of what we're looking at, how we're viewing migration from a radar lens. And in the US, we're sort of fortunate for a couple of different reasons for migration monitoring. One being that we have a unique radar network across the US. So all of these white points that just showed up exist a radar station. So these are radars you're actually probably familiar with, just maybe not in the perspective of looking at bird migration. So these are the radars that are going to be detecting weather events. If you want to know if it's raining or there's a thunderstorm approaching, maybe there's a hurricane coming through the Gulf of Mexico or a tornado through the Central Flyway. These are the same radars you would tune in on the Weather Channel, for instance. So what do those data actually look like? Again, you're probably familiar with this depiction. So this is a radar product called radar reflectivity. And this is a snapshot, a 5-minute snapshot from all 143 radars on the night of April 5th, 2019. And this reflectivity measure simply measures the water content in the atmosphere. So warmer colors, the oranges, reds, show you where there's more water in the atmosphere. The thing that you often don't see, however, is that meteorologists work really hard to show you these data, but in the background, this is what's actually going on. All of the stuff that just populated here are migratory birds moving through the lower atmosphere at night. So as we've already talked about, the vast majority of birds that move through North America fly under the cover of darkness. So what can we use these data for? How can we actually deploy them for conservation challenges? So I just want to mention this, that these data, they're freely accessible. They come in every 5 and 10 minutes, all days around the year, and they go back and are archived for 20+ years. So that's how we've been able to tap into this data stream to answer, I think, important conservation-related questions. So one thing that's slowed some of the progress here is identifying that precipitation. For us, that's clutter. For meteorologists, that's the thing they're interested in. So we do the reverse of what meteorologists have done for decades, and we remove the precipitation to maintain all of the biology, in this case, migratory birds. So I just want to jump into one focal study that we've looked at, and Zach already mentioned this. So we can zoom into what lights are doing at a small scale, and then I'll zoom back out to give a larger scale perspective. So let's jump over to New York City. And here we have the September 11th tribute in light. Again, probably a light source that most folks are familiar with. And also, it occurs one night out of the year, so it's quite unique, but has allowed us this unique insight. If there is extreme light sources, what is the impact on migratory birds? So we were able to use radar data to look at the disproportionate effect of lights on these birds. So just to give you a little bit of reference here, this is a radar image that I'm showing you here. The black dot shows you where the tribute in light is located. So it's located on lower Manhattan. And this radar snapshot that we have here is from September 11th, 2015 at 10:12 p.m., so well into the night. And in this context, the tribute in light lights have been turned off. There's a reason for that, is when we visually detect 1,000 birds through our binoculars, through other observations, the lights are turned off. When they're off, we can see that the birds start to clear out of the area, but the radar tells us a little bit different story. It allows us to quantify how many birds are in the area. So in this snapshot here, we're estimating around 500 birds are in the surrounding area of the tribute in light. This is probably the baseline of just nocturnal migration. And then 20 minutes later, we get a new radar sample, and the tribute and light has already been turned on. So just 20 minutes later, this is what the radar depiction actually looks like. So again, just 20 minutes later, we're now detecting just under 16,000 birds surrounding the tribute and light. So now the lights are fully on, and we can see this influx of migrants. So this happens time and time again throughout the night if there's pretty intense migration. In over 7 years of doing this monitoring, that equates to 7 nights, we estimated on a range of 1.1 million birds came in and out of the tribute and light through those 7 nights. So it's quite staggering. However, we also know that the tribute and light is relatively unique for a couple of different reasons. There's really not a light source like this on the landscape, really anywhere else probably in the world. So what our next question was to say, can we actually rank maybe US cities? Those are the heart of where this light pollution is coming from, as we already have seen. So could we actually say, is New York City, in fact, the worst offender for light pollution? Or is there maybe a different dimension to this story? Specifically, how many birds might fly over New York City? Or maybe how many birds fly over Denver, Colorado? Or Boulder, Colorado, etc. So that's what we set out to do. We ranked the 125 largest US cities. So that's where we focused our effort on. It's probably quite obvious why we did that, but just for reference here, the top 125 largest US cities account for 2.1% of the landmass of the lower 48 states. When we look at light pollution, however, it accounts for a pretty disproportionate amount. Around 35% of all light pollution in the US, in the lower 48 states, comes from these 125 cities. So we went ahead, we ranked these US cities not just by photo pollution, but also the product of how many birds fly over that city. So it's both the confluence of light pollution and migratory activity. So I'm going to show you how all of the cities, these 125 cities, shake out. So on the y-axis here on the left side, we're going to have a spring rank. So we were interested, are there differences in this ranking? Is New York City the highest photo polluter and number of birds coming over it spring and fall? Or maybe there's seasonal differences. This is the way the data shake out here. So the points relate to individual cities. The color of the points relates to how bright the city is. And then the size of the point shows us the size or the area of that city. So the brightest city in the US, probably no surprise, is Las Vegas. Second brightest is New Orleans. Any city that sits below this dotted line would tell us that the risk for pollution and migratory birds is higher during the fall, and anything above this white dotted line tells us that the risk is higher during the spring. We can see where Denver and Colorado Springs rank on here, and the ranks are such that Denver during the spring is 49th and 54th during the fall. Colorado Springs, a smaller city, maybe less photo pollution, falling a bit further back in this ranking. So I just want to talk a little bit about this story in the context of Colorado. So what I'm going to show you are some radar data from 2018 from the Denver, Colorado radar. So migration tends to follow a pattern that looks like this, where we get these lulls of activity, and then activity begins to pulse up and down as weather patterns promote migration or shut down migration at large scales. So if we were to say turning off your lights in maybe a dynamic way, we would probably want to highlight the nights where the activity is greatest. So at the low end, this is what it would look like from a radar depiction. At the high end, the greatest activity for this spring season, this is what it would look like. And it just takes 3 nights, at least in this year, to account for 50% of the migrants passing through the Denver area. Those nights span, around 19 nights. So again, this is a little unique, but what does this look like across maybe the US and across 20 plus years of radar data? When we look at lots of data, we see the same story. across many nights, we don't see a tremendous amount of activity. The bottom 50% of nights account for just around 7% of migratory activity. The next 20%, 10% of activity. The next 20% of nights account for around 29% of activity. And then hopefully this is a big takeaway here, that it's just around 10 nights where we're getting more than half of the activity moving through areas through the United States. So this is a challenge, and we've been able to put this into action now of saying, if we can isolate these big nights of migration, we should be able to get some buy-in for lights out. So we do this through the Birdcast project. This is joint collaboration between Colorado State University, the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and the University of Massachusetts. So you can go to the aeroecolab.com or birdcast.info to see our forecast of nightly migration. So it could be tonight, tomorrow, or the night after. The maps that I'm going to show you here are for spring migration of 2020. So you can see maps of where migrants are flying on a given night and how that evolves into the future. We've now have translated these intensities of migration, the warmer colors being more migrants. We've translated these into alerts. So a red showing us where great migratory activity is likely to occur, an area where we would hope to get lights out initiatives going on that specific night. And we can see those across 3 future dates. You can zoom into parts of Colorado, and you can see all of these images. They're always updated daily to see how many birds are expected to be flying over Denver, Aurora area, Colorado Springs. Now the maps include Fort Collins as well, and how those evolve and how the forecasts evolve. So I'd be happy to take questions when we do have time, but I appreciate you tuning in. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Horton. That was great. This is Richard again, and I'm working on getting to take over the screen again. Can someone confirm that you can see what I'm showing now?
I can see it.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that, because I can't really tell for sure what you can see. But anyway, this little segment that I'm going to talk about, some of the possible solutions here that we need to work out. And again, this is all work in progress. But as you've heard, there are 2 main problems here. One is building collisions, and the other one is navigational disruption. And I think they're both important. What we would request from all Coloradoans is that they follow a voluntary lighting curfew to shut off all outdoor lights by midnight during migration season. And second, to shield all outdoor lights. And those would address the two issues. There are some exceptions to the voluntary curfew. Lights that are activated by motion sensors can remain powered on because they're off most of the time anyway. Businesses that are open after midnight could keep the lights on until they close. Street lights are really under the control of city governments, and we'll hope that most cities will take some sort of action, but it will vary from city to city as to exactly what action they take on street lights regarding this. And finally, any lights that are required for aviation safety obviously need to stay on all the time. We can't shut those off. But anyway, in terms of research, we've already heard a lot about research, but in particular, research related to lights out programs. There's quite a bit of evidence already showing what the value is of what most of the lights out programs do, which is a voluntary lighting curfew, and that by creating the curfew, they can reduce the number of collisions between birds and buildings. And you've all seen the rather memorable pictures of piles of dead birds. That's very photogenic and very easy to remember. But there's very little, to my knowledge, there's little evidence yet that shielding can help reduce navigational disruption in migratory birds. Now, I know I'm hoping we'll make progress on that, but nevertheless, it seems likely that shielding will be helpful. So we don't really have any evidence to support the idea, but our previous experience seems to indicate that shielding would be helpful. So most of you have seen this image or something like it. This is from the Audubon website, a picture of the United States at night, and you see two things automatically. You very quickly here, you see that the western or the eastern half of the United States has in very bad shape in terms of light pollution. And that's really a minefield for migratory birds to try to get through. Things are a little better in the west, but you can see pretty clearly the Front Range urban corridor just a little bit to the left of center in this picture. And you can see Denver as the biggest blotch and other cities of the Front Range urban corridor to the north and south of it there. And they are also a problem. So any birds migrating up through eastern Colorado, this is going to be an issue for them. If we zoom in and see a photo that's closer on southern Colorado, we see Denver at the top, and then Colorado Springs, and we see Canyon City and Pueblo near the bottom. Obviously, Denver is much bigger, and so it's a bigger problem, but that doesn't mean that the smaller cities are not a problem too. They are, and we need to address that. Here's an aerial photo taken of a portion of Pueblo. And in this picture, you can see roughly 100 unshielded lights. Now, I'm not picking on Pueblo. Pretty much every city on the Front Range has the same problem here. So all of these lights, almost all of these lights that you can see are unshielded, and we want to change that. We want to see that change. Now, what do I mean by shielding? Well, when we zero in a little bit and see a daylight photo from the street side, and we see this yellow arrow in the bottom, you can see where the photo was taken. You can see the unshielded lights, the 5 spherical shaped lights that are the street light, and you see a well-shielded light, which is inside the parking lot inside. From the aerial photo, you see the unshielded light source completely, but you do not see any light source on the shielded light. You see a pool of light on the pavement, but you don't see the light source itself. And that's what we're shooting for, is to turn all of these bright light sources into things that look like that to the birds. That's the goal. Okay, now it's not just street lights that matter. Residential lights matter too. And you don't have to have a tall building to have a problem with shielding and too much light. Now this display shows a number of examples of residential lights. If I leave the lights on in the room, but just turn on these 6 lights, it looks like this. You can see almost nothing other than the bright glary lights. The rest of the room becomes almost impossible to see. Now, without changing the setting on the ambient room lighting, if I turn those 3 lights off, you can see quite well with just the dark sky lights on. The dark sky lights don't inhibit our ability to see at all because they're well shielded. If you can see the light source at all, then that's not shielded. And so these 3 are not at all shielded. These 3 are all shielded. You don't see the light source at all. And that's what we're shooting for. Now, this middle one is an old-fashioned light that we see a lot in our communities. And all I did was add an aftermarket shield to it. Here's what the light looks like without the shield. Whoops, I skipped one. There's the light and the shield sitting on the table. But if I lift it up and without any tools, put that shield on the light, then voila, I get a well-shielded light. And so that's as simple as it is for existing lights. We just need to put shields on them. Secondly, these other 2 examples you see here are examples that might be installed with new construction or remodeling or whatever. These require a contractor to actually install them. But in terms of money saving, the one on the right, the far right, is the cheapest of all of the possible options. Now, it's the most expensive to buy up front, but once you factor in the cost of electricity, it becomes way cheaper than any of the others. And one of the main reasons for that is it's got an integrated motion sensor on it. So it's only on when it detects motion. And that saves a tremendous amount of electricity. As well as, all of these are well shielded too, so they're going to be good for the environment. If you're interested in finding lights that are like this, if you look for this seal, then you can be guaranteed that the product, the fixture, conforms to all of the recommendations of the IDA. Now, on big projects, professional lighting designers kind of know what the IDA recommendations are, and so they don't really need this. But smaller projects, you really need this seal to guide you. Now, it says that it will meet the shielding recommendations of IDA, as well as a number of other things that are a little bit harder to see at first glance. So I recommend that you look for the seal on the packaging of any lighting that you're interested in buying. Finally, there are two questions that come up all the time with regard to lighting and possible changes. One is, don't we need light for safety? And the second is, how much will this cost? Well, let's look at safety first. In these pictures, that on the top left, you see a completely unshielded light that's causing a real safety problem. There's a person standing in the shadow that we can't see at all because of the glare from that light. Once we put a hand up to block the glare, then we start to be able to see the person in the shadow, kind of in the gate there. So you can see how the glare is reducing our ability to see what we need to see. In the second pair of photographs here, we see on the bottom left, we see what appears to be a well-lit sidewalk and a person in the distance there that you can see quite well. And in the second photo, all that's happened is that person has moved into a shadow and it's impossible to see them anymore. And the reason it's impossible to see them is because of the glare from those lights. If those lights were shielded, we could see into the shadows much better. So glare causes safety problems. So how much will this cost? Well, the good news is in most cases, the electricity savings will be greater than the cost of the project. The electricity savings will be greater than the cost of the project. One example of a big project, in the city of Tucson, Arizona, they replaced most of their streetlights with LEDs, and they implemented dimming at midnight. And they're now saving a huge amount of electricity. And also, they have an extra $4 million in their budget to spend on other things. So there's an example where they did everything that the IDA is recommending, and they ended up with $4 million of free money. So that's good news indeed. Here's what it looks like in Tucson after the curfew, after midnight. You see most of the lights in this photo have been shut off. The street lights have been dimmed, but you're still able to see what you need to see perfectly fine. It doesn't look like what most cities look like today, because we see, even at 4 a.m., we see brightly lit parking lots and things like that with, completely empty parking lots that are brightly lit at 4 a.m. And in Tucson, they've figured out a way forward, a way to get past that. They've implemented street light dimming at midnight, and then most other lights have to be turned off by midnight. Now, if there are businesses that are still open, they can keep their lights on until the business closes. So now, questions and comments. First of all, for our folks that may be watching the video recording of this, I want to especially stress that we still want to hear your comments. Would you please email me at richardobrien@darksky.org. Or if you need to write to Dr. Horton, it's Kyle, and I'm not sure I got the address right now that I see it. But Dr. Horton, could you confirm, is this a good address for you?
Yep, that works.
Okay, great. And his website that he mentioned in his talk is wonderful. I highly recommend it. It's called arrowecolab.com. If you go to that, you can see, for example, the migration forecasts, what they're forecasting for migration through Denver, for example. If you email a comment to Dr. Horton, please also CC me so that I can keep your comment in our archive. I will keep your name and your email address private, but I will make sure that the comment gets seen by the people who are working on the project. Also, many of you watching may be already familiar with how you reach Zach, and I'm not sure again that email address is correct for Zach. Did I get that right, Zach?
That one is correct, yes.
Okay, very good. And you've all, the Audubon members have all been to the Audubon website and the Audubon Rockies website, I'm sure. Once again, if you email a comment to Zach about Lights Out Colorado, please also put my name in the CC line. That way we can be sure that your comment gets into the archive. And finally, we'd like to have any live people that we have start a discussion. If we don't have any comments or questions for discussion, then I have some here that we can choose from. So Megan, can you, let's see, I can't see the chat window. Let me stop sharing here. Yes, there are some items in the chat window now. So let's see. Okay. Quite a few things from Peg. Okay, does exposure to artificial lights at night interfere with human circadian rhythms? Yes, that's the short answer. Not exactly part of our discussion tonight of birds, but yes, that's a big problem, and that's something we can address and we can talk about on the side. Does the color of light matter? Again, yes, it makes a big difference to humans. We're not sure if it makes a big difference to birds or not. The jury's still out, as far as I know, on that. Are pink highway lights better for migrating birds? Gentlemen, do we have any research that says anything about color and birds? I'm not aware of any research, but
I can jump in real quick, maybe. Yeah, I don't know about maybe specific to pink highway lights. So that would certainly be something outside of what has been studied previously. A lot of the original work that occurred with the color of lights actually happened maybe 30, 40 years ago on communication towers. So there used to be a lot of collisions with communication towers in regard to the lights that would be flashing or constantly glowing on TV towers, radio frequency towers. And I would say, and agree with Richard's previous comment about maybe the jury's still out on the color of light of which is most efficient. But it seems like, from the evidence that we have, that a red flashing light on these towers actually reduces collisions, doesn't seem to get that circling nature that we get with a bright white glowing light through the night. But I still think that's an open area for research, and one that we're also interested in too, as we make shifts from more yellow lights to more blue LED lights too, of how that might be impacting migratory birds too. So still, it's really the frontier of some of the research that's out there right now.
And I will mention again that the bluish white light is not recommended by IDA anywhere, and there are definite human healthcare problems related to it, which we can talk about at another time. So regardless of whether the bluish white light is particularly bad for birds or not, the IDA does not recommend it, and it doesn't cost any more to put in the orangish white lights and they are better for human health. So that's recommended. Okay, next question Peg put in here was radar can be used to track insect and bat migrations too. Have those populations been affected by light pollution too? I know Dr. Horton has something to say about this.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to jump in here. So I think that's one of the things that we've been interested in, is trying to utilize these radar data to look at population trends. So the paper that was mentioned by Zach and Richard, maybe Peg 2, about the loss of 3 billion birds, focused largely on breeding bird survey data through the US and Canada. But even in that study, there was a documentation of radar declines in migratory birds. And that was really one of the first studies to look at that, of trying to use 10, 15 years of radar data to look at population trends. Again, one of the limitations of the radar data is that we don't know much about species. But nonetheless, we're seeing signals there that populations of birds are showing up as declining from the radar perspective. I would say we're still, just jumping into population trends with bats and insects. There's some work that has been done with Mexican free-tailed bats in Texas around Bracken Cave, where they're seeing some trends in the timing of when those bats arrived to Texas. But I don't think sizable shifts in populations have been documented yet from the radar perspective, at least on that bat community. And I know there's work being done currently on insects. So mayfly emergences out of the Great Lakes. A recent study came out from a colleague, Phil Stepanian at Notre Dame, and he was seeing actually very rapid and precipitous declines in mayfly emergences. So you would imagine the millions, if not billions or trillions of mayflies that come out of large water bodies, that we're seeing declines in those massive populations. That's quite unfortunate, and eye-opening too, that there's definitely something going on there.
Interesting. Okay. Another question. Let's see. Say a little more about Birdcast. I think that's for you again, Dr. Harden.
Sorry, I don't want to monopolize this either. So Birdcast, as I said, is a collaborative project where we try to put out exciting data products, stories around bird migration. So we utilize a lot of radar data. So we forecast migration days in advance. We try to utilize those forecasts too to say if there's something interesting going on or a big migratory movement occurring in Colorado or other parts of the US, the Northeast, the Central Flyway, the Southeast and West. We're able to utilize the forecast in that capacity. On that website, we also have a live migration feed there too. So a colleague, Adrian Doctor at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, serves up these data products too. So you can, we convert the raw radar data into a more appealing and friendly version of it. So you can tap in and see as new radar images come in each night throughout the entire year. That's what Birdcast offers. There's fun migration stories there too, whether it's oddities showing up from atmospheric events that blow birds from Europe to North America, or rarities in the migration world. So there's a lot of information there. It's certainly a fun project.
This is really revolutionary. I mean, for those of us that are amateurs, we really don't know what birds are up there in the air at night. And your work and the work of your colleagues has really made a huge difference with that. It's like eye-opening. It's great. Thank you.
And I'm sharing the Birdcast live map here. So this is for tonight, and you can see it's showing 10:20 Eastern, or 8:20 Eastern. So 6:20 for Mountain Standard. And so this is what Dr. Horton was talking about. So it's that visualization of the raw data that maybe would be harder to interpret, and it's interpreted in this beautiful graphic way that shows you the direction birds are moving and then the traffic rate. And so I've used this for years, and it's awesome to get to be on this this chat tonight with Dr. Horton, who was instrumental in this. So this is a great tool, and it's birdcast.info. if you want to explore more of the pieces of this.
Great, thank you, Zach, for sharing that. What would be the savings to local governments if lighting was reduced? Well, that's probably for me. The savings vary a tremendous amount from city to city. I mentioned the example of Tucson, Arizona, where they saved over $4 million a year during their lighting upgrade, which is a real success story. I can also share some cities, not in Colorado, who have rushed into doing an upgrade that wasn't well thought out and then got sued and lost. And so it ended up costing them millions of dollars because they had to go back and replace all of the lights that they had just changed. So the moral to the story there is, get some help, get some opinions from experts before a city moves into this. And we can't expect our city council members to know a great deal about this. So, it's not surprising if they don't know much, and therefore if they don't know how to save money on lighting. Let's see. Pueblo and southern Colorado don't have high-rise buildings, but what can neighborhoods do to help migrating birds? Well, as I mentioned, unshielded lights are a problem at any level, and they're just as much of a problem coming from houses as they are from skyscrapers. In fact, from 5,000 feet above the ground, the birds don't really see a difference between a skyscraper and anything else. And they're usually at night, they are flying quite high, as I understand it. So, whether it's a one-story building or a 50-story building really doesn't make any difference to the birds. And that's where we think, my IDA colleagues and I think that maybe lights out programs have kind of missed part of it, because most lights out programs do not do anything for the low buildings around. They focus mostly on the skyscrapers in the large city centers. And so they're appealing to a few dozen building managers. And I don't know, you might ask around, but I bet lots of people don't even know that there is a Lights Out Denver program, because there are two groups of people that know a lot about Lights Out Denver. One group are the building managers who have been approached to try to shut down their lights during migration season. And that's, like I say, only maybe a couple of dozen people. And then the Audubon Society members who have volunteered to collect data on bird collisions. So they walk around downtown Denver looking for dead birds. And so those two groups of people know a lot about Lights Out Denver, but it really doesn't reach out to the average citizen at all. This proposal for Lights Out Colorado would be trying to reach the millions of people involved, the millions of people in Colorado, and not just a couple of dozen people who happen to manage skyscrapers in downtown Denver. As you can see from the satellite photos, from the space station photos, the lights are quite visible in Pueblo as they are in Denver. It's just a smaller area. So there is a problem there too, and I'm hoping we can do something about it. Now, the question is still open as to whether shielding will really make a difference or not, and we don't really have any evidence about that one way or the other yet. But hopefully maybe in the future we will have some evidence. Let's see, how many dark sky communities are there in the US? Quite a few. Zach?
So the United States and Canada, at least within Audubon's database, there are 33.
Okay. Well, and I know the IDA dark sky places in Colorado, there are now, I think, 6 dark sky parks and like 3 dark sky communities. So the dark sky parks are mostly national parks or run by the National Park Service. There are now a couple, there's one state park, Jackson Lake State Park, out near Fort Morgan. And there's another park in the western slope that most people don't know very much about yet. So let's see. We have another 5 minutes left. Let me see if I can bring up the questions that I had again. Okay, can someone confirm that you can see this screen?
Can see.
Great, thank you. So some of the questions that I know we have, and while we have the experts here, it would be good to talk about them, were what specific dates should we use? Now, Dr. Horton, you said that just a few days a year is when all the birds are moving. Can we figure out exactly when that should be for eastern Colorado and specify a fairly narrow range of dates?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we do have a range of time, sort of these envelopes of time where we expect around 50% of birds will be moving through given areas. So we do have those dates. I don't know them off the top of my head, but we could obviously provide them too. So you're anywhere from probably mid-April to mid-May for spring and mid-September into October for the fall. And then we'll just say sort of this statement here of we've been looking at this strategy too of, you could say turn off your lights for a continuous time period that is, 2 weeks, for instance. But maybe you would, be inefficient in that mechanism. So saying turn off your lights when there's not many birds flying at night, or maybe there's a big night of migration that occurs outside of that envelope of time. So the forecasts allow us to be a little bit more dynamic too, that we put out the alerts. So if building managers or even, flicking off the light in your front porch on those specific nights, that can probably reduce the amount of human effort that has to go into this too. So there's a couple of different strategies to do this of saying, turn off your lights for a continuous time period, 2-3 weeks maybe, or turn off your lights on maybe the 10 very specific nights where there's a lot of migration occurring.
And as I understand it, the migration flow varies a lot with the weather, right? So the days may vary a little bit from year to year, correct?
Yep, that's exactly right. So essentially we utilize meteorological forecasts to make our bird migration forecasts. So we're acutely tuned into things like air temperature, wind speed and direction, barometric pressure, and a whole slew of other predictors.
It would be great if we could get the TV news channels to put your migration forecast on every night during migration season. Has there been any effort to do that?
I fully agree with that statement and support it. We've tried and reached out, and we continue to do it this fall. We've had some stories picked up, but it doesn't seem like it's a regular occurrence at this point.
Yeah, well, maybe someone who is watching this broadcast can think of an idea to help make that happen. Second question, how can the program have the most benefit for migratory birds? Now, I already mentioned that I don't think we really know that the shielding is going to work, but it seems like a good guess, and it's a place to start. Do either of you have some comments about that?
I guess this is a question for Dr. Horton on with the tribute lights, which have had significant study. Has there been any looking into, okay, so shutting them off obviously had a positive effect on the birds, allowing them to scatter. Would blocking the lights at a certain level have a similar effect, or would they just be drawn lower? Or has there been studies on that yet?
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about in terms of how high they cast up into the airspace. My guess would be that even if we could shield that very intense light source, we'd still get birds pulled in and presumably at lower elevations. So they tend to come in at high elevations, and then they seem to circle down. So if we left the lights on very long, they would start getting even closer to the buildings themselves. So we have a study that's going on right now in Chicago. So there does seem to be, this is a little bit of a tangent from shielding per se, But one thing that we've always been lacking is this direct connection between light pollution, the intensity, and then mortality events. The tribute in light obviously is visually, we can see the birds being attracted, but we don't see a lot of mortality there. However, we know that big collisions occur at some of these skyscrapers. So a colleague, Benjamin Van Doren, who I also work with on the forecasting side of things, is leading a study right now of how many lights on a single building in Chicago are illuminated, and then the relationship between how many dead birds show up the morning after that event. So we're seeing some convincing results and linkages there too, which is exciting. Maybe in a bad way of being exciting, but nonetheless some concrete evidence.
That's interesting. Well, let's skip to the very last question because we're about out of time. How can we measure the success or failure of the program? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think from a human side, at least, raising awareness on the issues, that are involved, and you can measure success in how many people are signing up, to get their buildings out, to get their house lights out, shielding their lights. And if this study that's happening, that talks about intensity, teaches us some things about maybe how shielding can influence positively. So from a human side, there's that, and then I'll let Dr. Horton speak to it from the bird side.
Yeah, I definitely second what Zach just mentioned there too, of just, how can we raise awareness, maybe even doing it in a more formal capacity of putting out surveys before we launch a lot of awareness, and then seeing if folks actually picked up the information after the fact. And then a lot of these volunteer programs where folks are going out each morning and seeing how many birds died, for instance, colliding with buildings. That's a big effort for those volunteers to wake up, go out, collect dead birds each morning. But there's really not a lot of other ways to actually monitor the success in that we're mitigating collisions. So my hat goes off to those folks that do that in various cities across the US, and it's really important data for scientists like myself to look at.
Great. Well, thank you, panel members. Megan and Peg, are you there? And will you like to sum up?
I forgot to unmute myself, but thank you so much for the great program. I personally learned a lot about what I can personally do to help. So thank you all for joining us tonight. And if there's no more questions,
everyone who attended.
Yeah, and thank you so much. And I'll leave now.
Okay. Thanks for hosting us, Megan, and Richard. Thanks for the invite. Great to meet everyone.